Welcome to the podcast Yakty Ukraine Life. Yakty means how are you in Ukrainian. I am your host Luzia Tschirky, a former correspondent, now a book author and a freelancer. Today's guest on the show is Mariam Naiem. Mariam is a Ukrainian author of Afghan origin. She holds a degree in cultural studies. Mariam writes, speaks and teaches on cultural issues with a focus on how imperial narratives have shaped and continue to distort perceptions of Ukraine. Since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, Mariam has dedicated her work to helping people outside of Ukraine understand the cultural and historical context of the war. Her goal is to decolonize discourse around Ukraine by centering Ukrainian voices and challenging long-standing imperialist narratives. Drawing on her own experience of living between Ukrainian and Western cultures, Mariam sees herself as a bridge, bringing context, nuance and Ukrainian perspectives to a foreign audience. Thank you so much for joining me here today, Mariam.
Thank you for having me.
Before I ask my first question, I want to say a few words. In preparing for this podcast, I came across something you wrote, that when foreigners ask you this, it sometimes brings tears and the urge to scream. So I want you to know that this space is your space, and please feel free to answer however you need.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Mariam, jak ty zaraz? How are you right now?
Somehow after first year of war, you start to understand that 1 year of war is a very long time. And somehow it's incredibly how time perception is changing. It always depends on your position in life and where are you in that moment. I remember after first year, I was thinking, okay, it's not possible to have one more year like that. That it's just, it felt like everyone is so tired. And like 1 year of war is like, 20 years or something like that. After second year, you just stop believing that is actually happening. But I felt like after third year, unfortunately, I think we are adapted in a way. So now, basically, this is a question that I'm asking myself, and question that we are discussing with my friends. It's kind of hard to imagine our identity. I'm not saying Ukrainian identity. I'm just saying our identity as a human being without war, because this is basically my 24/7 job in a way, and I just feel like I am adapted to this reality. And I think with some psychological help, I feel a bit better. But I think that third year is the year when you need to face the reality and withdrawal effect after all of the adrenaline work that you have done like years before. So now you're kind of facing the consequences that your body is like, okay, we need to discuss that. So I guess this will be the most honest answer to the question. Yeah.
We are recording this episode a few days after the Ukrainian capital was attacked by Russian drones and missiles for nearly 9 hours. The numbers of confirmed deaths is now 30, with 172 people wounded. You wrote a post on social media, and I quote now, "While you scrolled, Ukraine burned. The world thinks the situation is getting better. Reality, civilian deaths are up 50% this year. Every day of silence makes Putin bolder. When war deaths become background statics, dictators win." End of quote. Are you afraid that the Russian army and the Russian president is going to win this war?
I think that I'm more afraid that if that happened, nobody would care. So I think with this amount of injustice that we're facing right now, it's just harder to believe in any narrative that we believed since childhood. I mean, when you are a child, you always read these tales, fairy tales with your parents. And the whole concept of Western fairy tales is the idea of the cycle but also idea that there is beginning and the very understandable consequences with justice and the end. So the idea that there is just in the world, I think it's very rooted into Western identity. When I'm saying Western identity, it's not like I'm saying that with some other part of the world is not there. It's more about that I know that about Western perception of the world. I think it's one of the reasons why people are jumping so fast into the victim blaming, because the idea that something bad could happen with the good people, it's something that basically shaking the reality. So it's much easier just to imagine that everything that happens with the reason, and in the end there will be justice. So I think that keeping that in mind, and when you kind of growing, you kind of realize, okay, it's not true. This is the reason why we call it fairy tales and the world of fantasies, and there's real life with the injustice all the time. And I'm not talking about war. I think that there is a lot of different personal losses that people can face all the time. But I guess that war is kind of a very concentrate level of injustice, and also war is constant metaphorical and literal scream. And when you see that world is not reacting the way how you think they should, that kind of makes it even worse. So I think that fear is not as scary as feeling of hopelessness. And I think that this is what we're feeling right now. I'm not saying that we don't have any hope anymore, but I think that our resources to being hopeful are kind of became low. So I'm more scared of that. And I remember one of my friends, but she told me that 2 years ago, she's very scared that at some point, even if Russia uses the nuclear weapon against Ukraine, nobody will react. Nobody reacts. And this is something that I think is very, very disturbing, because coming from the point of it's hard to imagine how you should be so let's put it that way, so sad about the world that you basically don't believe that anyone will react to this kind of injustice. So I'm more fear of that. I'm a fear of that world will react fast enough. And right now when we're reading the history books, we're reading and thinking, oh my God, it was so obvious. Society should have reacted faster. And I just don't want to be that Ukraine will be that line in the history books in the future.
Listening to your answer, a feeling came to my mind that maybe to describe the feeling, you also wrote about in your post that it's more a feeling of the fear of being left alone with fighting against Russia. Would that be more accurate?
I think so, but it also, I think it would be rather better to explain it through the example of small talks. When I go outside of Ukraine, sometimes even from my friends, I hear something like, "Okay, but it's better right now in Ukraine," and I kind of realized that. First of all, I'm not angry with those kind of questions, because I don't feel like it's people's fault that they are not keeping up with everything. But it's also important to understand that, okay, with this amount of news that we have every day from all around the world, the globalization gave us this possibility of absorb a lot of information. And if you're in the news feed 24/7, it's not very good for your mental health as well. So I completely understand why people are not constantly in reality of Ukraine. But for what is important for me is that I think that people assume in Ukraine is something better, or the situation is a bit better, because there is not enough of the media coverage. Because again, if you don't hear about something for a long time, you kind of assume that it's kind of getting better. I don't know if I can give you a metaphor. It's like, when people have some problematic situation in their household, and if you're not complaining about it all the time, people can assume that, okay, everything is kind of better. So for me, it was kind of obvious that, okay, some fact that, for example, as Russia killed, I don't know, just as example, 20 civilians 3 years ago would have made a main article in the newspaper. But right now, okay, it's just an everyday news, and we have the habit of war, routine of war, which I think is pretty sad. And this is also something that makes us feel more left alone, like we are alone here. Of course, we can talk about political situation, and of course, with the Trump election, it's not making it easier. But I think overall, the idea that we don't have as much attention as before would kind of, for me, like something very illogical, because with every day, Russia kills more and more people. And somehow, like, when you think about it kind of rational or ethical, you think that, okay, the more people someone kills, the more coverage it should have, or like people should talk about this more. But it's not how news works. And I think that overall, kind of highlighting the main problem that we right now have with the social media, also social media, but media itself. I think it was in work of Fusion Zontag, but I'm also trying to write about this in op-ed, that I feel like media, but also consumers kind of focus on the war porn rather than people itself. Like we are the deliverers of the war porn, and it should be interesting, entertaining, new. Like the more blood, the better it sells. I don't think it's only about Ukraine. We can see that in different conflicts right now. And I think somehow it's very sad. I think if we're not talking specifically about Ukraine, let's say something about as a society. That right now, okay, it's not enough just to hear about that, somebody, some crazy, unhumane behavior killed, I don't know, thousands of civilians. It should be also advertised in that way that it could cause attention, and it should be, I don't know, like appealing, sexy. That's why I call it war porn. So yeah, I think overall that just sad for us as Ukrainians. But as a person who just study culture, I think that also saying something about us, and this is kind of a new era in a way of the maybe our empathy shaped in different way. I think we kind of have a thicker skin, but not thicker skin because we have more experience with the world. I think it's thicker skin because we just saw so many things, and with the AI and with the highly realistic video games, like everything is just basically kind of look the same, like blood there, it's kind of the same. So it's much harder to understand where is the reality and where is the basically hyper realistic unreal world. So yeah, I'm thinking that for sure both two factors making us feel more left alone and lonely, basically.
Before I would like to talk about the roots of the war against Ukraine, I'd like to ask you about your family background and upbringing. You describe yourself as a Ukrainian and of Afghan origin, the daughter of a Ukrainian mother, Valentina Kolechka, and of Afghan father, Mariam Naiem. Your father was the former Minister of Education in Afghanistan. How did your parents meet?
I remember when it was oh my God, I think, yes, New York Times, they wrote about that he was minister, and I said, but he was vice minister. And they told me, it's not so important, but for me it is important. So he was vice minister of education, but nevertheless. So yeah, he was basically in charge of creating new schools around, like in Afghanistan at the time. After war, when war with the Soviet Union started, it was kind of obvious for my father that he could not stay in Afghanistan since he was not supporting religious groups for sure, and he was not communist as well. So he decided to, and his wife died after giving birth to my second brother, and he decided that it will be better for him to leave the country, and it will be more safe. Since there were not a lot of options, one of the easiest way for him, since he also wanted to continue his education, and Soviet education was not one of the worst in the world, let's put it that way. So he decided to do the PhD in child psychology in Moscow. And so he could be better father for his kids that left without mother. And my mom was there also doing her PhD in child psychology. And this is how they met in Moscow when they were, I think, 30, yeah, the same age as me, 34, something like that. And but my mom, she's from Kyiv, and she always liked Kyiv, and she never wanted to stay in Moscow. So it was kind of obvious that the moment they will finish their thesis, they will go to Ukraine together. And this is what happened. My father took my brothers to Ukraine after that. And in a couple of years, I appeared to this world.
Looking back, how has your family background shaped your view on questions of identity in Ukraine?
I think, as most people who are I don't know, by culture, it's always understandable that identity is something that you can shape and that you can acquire and that you can build, basically. It's not something that you have since birth. I think maybe it kind of give you the better understanding the value of the term. Also the idea that, okay, there are different identities and they are also changing. I think the most natural thing in nature is changes. So it's also kind of completely understandable to acknowledge that identity, you and your identity could change with time. And also the idea of identity of each country for sure changing with time. So I think for sure that gave me the possibility to maybe, the time when I was not ready mentally for that, like in teenage years, I already kind of were forced to think about the identity and who am I? Like the question of identity is basically very, very easy question. Who am I? What am I? Why I am Mariam? Why I'm not Maria? And the more Ukrainian word and so on. Or, for example, I remember, if you read Ukrainian literature, the most common Ukrainian beauty standard is black eyes and black eyebrows, brown. But somehow I knew that I don't look Ukrainian, and it was also kind of confusing for me. So I think the idea that identity is something that you kind of build and create, and this is a value, first of all. It's not something that it's not a heritage. It's something that you need to acquire.
How did your lived experience challenge also the Western stereotypes of what Ukrainian is? What can you describe moments where you really kind of challenge, even, the perspective people in Western countries have about Ukrainians?
To be honest, I really don't know, because I see sometimes that people are surprised that, I don't look Ukrainian, I don't have Ukrainian name, but people don't say it out loud. They don't say, oh, I didn't think you look Ukrainian. It's more like, if it's just some acquaintance on the street, they will say something like, oh, I thought you're from India or something like that. But if it's a deeper discussion, nobody will ever say to you that, oh, you don't look Ukrainian. This is one of the challenges that a lot of immigrants or people who just change the country facing all the time. At some point when you are connecting or communicating with people outside of your country, you became a representative of the culture. And wherever your identity is, they will assume that this is Ukrainian thing. So, for example, I know that at some point my colleagues were assuming that all Ukrainians are very, very, very straightforward, bold. I don't know is it true or not, but this is what they assumed, because because I'm that way. And I was trying to say, okay, I cannot say that this is true for sure, or, I cannot deny it as well. But this is also interesting. And we discussed that also with my Indian friend. Like he also feel always this pressure. He tried to be extra polite, extra nice, because he knew that everyone will think that this is the way how Indian people behave. So I think what I'm trying to do and what I'm kind of trying to work on, I am less categorical. I think like I'm trying to be more polite. In more honest words, I'm censoring myself, and I'm trying also. I know that if you want to be, if you want people to listen to you, you should not scream. They will, in other words, they will hear you but not listen to you. And I want people to listen, so that's why I need to scream somewhere else. And it's also kind of important to find the safe place to scream.
Just the example you just mentioned about people approach you and ask you, "Oh, are you from India?" I read that in former times when you were asked in Ukraine, "Where are you from?" you actually said at some point that you're from India. Is that correct? And can you tell us why?
In Ukraine, for example, people who were serving as a part of Soviet army in Afghanistan, after war, they were called Afghans. So just imagine you are like, I don't know, 7 years old and you go to school and somehow you hear that someone saying, "Oh, my father is Afghan." And you're like, "Oh, my father is also Afghan." And you're like, "Oh, okay. Oh, okay, it's different." So to have Afghan identity, it's not the identity that it's very nice to have. Like it was not very nice. Still, it's not very it's not very easy. I remember one journalist asked me where I'm from. I said I'm half Ukrainian, half Afghani, and he was like, "Okay, this is two very very cool identities right now." Um, and because it was not beneficial identity, let's put it that way. So it was easier for me to say that I'm from India, since in Soviet Union, because of the anti-capitalistic propaganda, they didn't have Hollywood movies, but they bought a lot of Bollywood movies. So people had the perception of India of something nice, something music, something beautiful. Like say even now in a lot of, of course, in Russia, in Ukraine, and in most post-Soviet countries, a lot of women who are like, 60, 70, they still like in the fan base of Indian famous Bollywood actors. So because of this nice image of India, because of Bollywood, I was like, okay, it's just easier to say that I'm from India, because to explain everything about Afghanistan, it's too much. And also, again, when I was a teenager, every time after 9/11, for a lot of people who look brown, uh, the problem of identity kind of changed a lot. So, of course, even before Afghanistan had a lot of problems, but after 9/11, it was kind of obvious that first thing they will say that you're a terrorist or something like that. But again, we're talking about kids. Kids are not like famous for being very ethical. So I kind of figure out that it's better to say that you're Indian, because people will assume something like sari and nice food, rather than, okay, in Afghanistan there is not a lot of nice stuff. So this was one of the reasons, and it was pretty painful to understand why I was doing that. But yeah, at some point I was like, okay, I need to acknowledge that. But to be honest, I do not look typical Afghani. They look a bit lighter. The contrast between eyebrows, eyes, and hair is a bit lighter. So I have actually roots from Kashmir, and my father look more Indian. This is true, but it doesn't make it better, because in any ways I was lying about my identity to make it easier. Let's put it that way.
The situation you just described about, other children in school saying that, "Oh, my father is an Afghan." Looking back, would you say this is your first experience, or one of your first experience of actually colonialism in your life?
I don't know. I think the first experience of colonialism, I think, is language. Like, I think it's moment when I realized, okay, there is people speak in my house in Russian. My father speaks with an enormous accent, and when I was 4 or 5, I think I was 4, I had the book sorry, I don't remember that in English, but basically the book when you're like mm, studying alphabet, like you kind of start to know what is letters. And I remember that I opened that book and it was in Ukrainian, and I was like, okay, this is different from Russian. The some sounds are different, and in the kindergarten, even though all the teachers were speaking in Russian, we were still doing all the reading exercises in Ukrainian. So you're like, okay, this is a bit confusing, but everyone. I think this is one part of being social creature. If everyone is doing that, you're doing the same, and you're kind of playing the game that this is normal. And the biggest kind of shock for me was when I was 7 and I think 10 days. My mom took me, I was still in the kindergarten because I need to go to school like the autumn of that year. And my mom bring me to the art school for painting. And I was there since I think until 10 years, yes. And my teacher, she was Ukrainian speaking person, first Ukrainian speaking person that I met in my life. And I remember how she was talking in Ukrainian to me, and I was completely shocked because she was using the word so softly, so nice. And it was first time when somebody you know said to me daughter in Ukrainian, not in Russian. And when she was describing colors, she was doing that so uh, yeah, magnificently. Like it was so beautiful in Ukrainian, and I kind of realized, okay, Ukrainian sounds very, very, very nice. And of course, like my teacher was great, and I think she's still great. But it was my first time when I saw that, okay, you can. It's not it's not for everyone that you speak Russian at home and you in school you're speaking Ukrainian. There are people who actually speak one language at home and in institutions. So I think for me it was the first example of if we're talking about the personal experience, because I don't think for a long time I actually realized what was happening in Afghanistan from the political point of view. Because to be very honest, I think the situation in Afghanistan, because of the civil wars that happened after that, because of religious like moment, and also the idea that US were giving money, USSR were giving, like all of that thing. It was not as simple as I don't want to say that this is simple now, but you know what I mean. Like there is always levels, and in some situation those levels are like much deeper. And so for a long time, I was not aware what exactly happened in Afghanistan. So for me, it was just easier to acknowledge that my first connection of with consequences of colonialism was for sure connected to language, because I'm still yes, I'm bilingual, but my mother tongue is Russian, which is ironic for sure. I'm not speaking Russian for for a long time, but nevertheless, if you will wake me up in the middle of the night and will ask my phone number, I will say it in Russian.
Looking back to my own time in school, when I heard the terms, colonies, colonialism, it was always related to former centuries, European countries, the British Empire, France, Germany, invading countries, having colonies on, several continents of this world. But in no time of my education, for example, during high school, the Russian Empire was named a colony ever. What do you think? What are the reasons the Russian Empire has not been seen through this lens of colonialism for such a long time?
Let's put it that way. First of all, there is overseas colonialism, and there is also settler colonialism. So settler colonialism is basically when you try to just spread borders on your land by swallowing countries, entities, societies next to you. And with overseas colonialism, you basically go somewhere and kind of like, but you also can do something else. You can also just use someone else's land for resources, or you can use those land to basically to live there. That people from your empire will kind of start to live, settler there. So with Russian imperialism, with Russian colonialism, it was more about settler. So it was kind of spreading what we can call the Russian identity. And for sure, yes, when Russia was empire, of course, for sure, people were acknowledging that this is empire. But with Soviet Union, it's something a bit more complicated, since with the communist ideology, imperialism was one of the last stages of capitalism. And for sure, communist regime were for a long time criticizing Western imperialism. Moreover, they were helping a lot of countries who were suffering from Western colonialism by giving them money, weapon, military support, political support, resources, and so on. So for a lot of countries who actually were also subjugated for a long time, Soviet Union was example of country that kind of helping to fight Western imperialism. And that situation kind of created a blind spot to Soviet imperialism itself, since in Soviet regime inside of Soviet Union, there were a lot of subjugation, racial problems, gulags, and so on, where actually Soviet regime saw Russian culture as a main culture, and everything else, every kind of a nationalism, every patriotism, were perceived as a separatist movement and were killed for that. So I think this is the reason why it's so complicated for a lot of people who had, let's put it that way, critical left theory approach to the post-colonial theory, which is connected, of course, to Marxism. It is so complicated to acknowledge, okay, there were actually problems of imperialistic ideology in Soviet Union itself. Because again, they actually helped a lot of countries. And again, when, right now, when Ukrainians are trying to describe that during the Revolution of Dignity, we were fighting for Western values. For a lot of people, Western values mean rape, killing, murder, subjugation, and using resources. So I think this is one of the reasons why, and also colonialism is very, very deeply connected to racism. So for a lot of people, it's also kind of obvious that to be in the relationship of colony and empire, you need to have a racial factor. But we can see that with Ireland, for example, that it's not always the case. But for sure, yes, with the racial factor, it is more complicated. Or even if we can say that, because there is additional problems to the power structure itself. I don't know if I answered the question.
You answered the question, absolutely. So what would you say, what makes Russia the imperial force and Ukraine its colony? What made that actually up?
One of the things is that Russia trying to, on a very basic level, they try to erase their identity, Ukrainian identity, and by firstly trying to erase the separation between Russian identity and Ukrainian identity. They try to say that this is the same, that this is brother nations, that language are the same, or that Ukrainian language is not the real language, because again, in Ukrainian situation, the language is basically the only marker, the main marker that can say, okay, this is Ukrainian, this is Russian. You know that this is an Ukrainian or Russian person when they open their mouth. So this is the reason why Ukrainian language is much more important for Ukrainian identity than for some other post-Soviet countries. For example, when we talk about Kazakh situation, there for sure language is very important, but they have the racial factor, and for them it's much harder to erase their identity because of the facial differences, and also because Russian, they don't want to call not white people Russians. They want to call only white people Russians, and that's why people from Belarus and Ukraine are perfect targets for that. So it's important. Like empires are always in the state of spreading. Otherwise, they're basically kind of dying, would dry out. Let's put it that way. So the main thing that Russia is trying to do is to erase and try to say that, first of all, Ukraine was never a country. People in Ukraine can never be independent. We don't know what is, how, like, we're too savage to be part of to have a separate independence, that our culture is not true, that everything is basically constructed by someone else and it's not real, and so on and so on. So by the denying of the existence of of course, we're talking right now on the cultural level, because first of all, I'm a culture studies person, but yeah, there are, of course, economical situation. There is a lot of political moments there. For sure, the puppet government that we had in Ukraine, it also worked for Russia for a long time. So I think for last 20, 30 years, Russia was trying to imply neo-colonialism on Ukraine, but right now they're kind of going back to the classic colonialism, when they just try to kill everyone, because for a long time, it was, since World War II, it was much easier for ex-empires just to implement the neo-colonialism by creating, some kind of a separatist movement, some kind of conflicts inside of the country that will kind of play the beneficial role for their empires. And it's easier because your people are not dying in those wars. But this is what Russia was trying to do. But right now they're kind of going back to the classic imperialism and classic colonialism by just going and killing people with their own hands, with their own people. Because on the very, very basic level, if anyone will ask you, by asking question why Russia is doing that, why Putin is doing that, there is no rational answer to that. There is because imperialism is not about rationality; it's about mythology, and those countries, they're striving on mythology, because there is actually there is no true value in imperialistic culture rather than subjugation. So it's much harder to actually explain why a country is so great if you remove this element of killing others.
What would you say? What are some key elements of Russia's imperial narrative about Ukraine? You mentioned a few when you talked about your Ukrainian teacher, or the first teacher that spoke in Ukrainian with you. What would you say? What are some key elements one can recognize this Russian imperial narrative?
In English, it will be people are saying in the Ukraine. That for sure, the first marker. You can also hear that in Russian language, because they're also using kind of wording that kind of showing that they don't perceive Ukraine as they're not using Ukrainian words and Ukrainian names in the right way. But for sure, it's language. First thing is language, like denying the language, denying that this is a separate language and this is not like a small sub-language of Russian. This is the first thing. Second thing, denying that Russia was implementing imperialism and Russia is an imperialistic state. When I'm trying to say that imperialistic, you can feel it from the perspective of I'm trying to say that imperialism is very hard to feel when you're not in those circle of the relationship, because it feels like passive-aggressive behavior again. Like in the couple, it's much harder to say to some of your friends, my partner is passive-aggressive, because your friend can say, oh, I was there and it didn't look like that. But you know that because you are in those relationships. So I think this is a very, very thin line, and it's much harder to explain exactly. But this is what I'm trying to show sometimes, that it's actually very, very like a thin level of narrative that you can feel. You always feel it as a Ukrainian, but when you are not Ukrainian, you always need to decode it. So, like the perception of that Russia culture is better. The idea that the idea itself that there is more better culture and worse culture, it's actually it's nonsense. There is no such thing. The idea that everyone for sure want to be part of Russian culture. Like if you don't want to be part of Russian culture, then you are crazy, and then you're barbaric, and then we will civilize you, aka kill you. because there is no other option. So the perception that your culture, the chauvinist idea that your culture is the main culture, I think this is the first way how you can know that you speak with imperialistic person, and kind of a like top-down view on Ukrainian culture, like yeah, sure, but there is no Dostoevsky and so on. Um, I think it's important to understand it's not only when we talk about Ukraine and Russia, but with a lot of different cultures, that if we know about some cultures and we know less about others, it's not because some cultures are greater and some cultures are worse. It's because some culture had more money, more influence than others. Because again, from the perspective of culture studies, there is no such a thing as a better culture and worse culture, because we are kind of all together. Of course, they are more aggressive and less, but this is a separate topic. So it's kind of important to keep in mind that if you don't hear about someone, it means that you hear about someone else too much, or maybe the forces are not equal.
Where do you still see imperial narratives in Western media coverage, for example, of Ukraine? Where do you see it still?
To be honest, very often it is, again, as a passive-aggressive behavior, it is with the tone. Like, Ukrainians are too emotional, or like, this is something that I can feel from the perspective of describing Ukrainians. Like, they are too aggressive, too emotional, they want too much. I think Fanon wrote that, like, person from Colony perceived as a teenager, emotional, aggressive teenager. And this is something that for sure I felt like people are like talking about Ukrainians are using those words a lot. Or another way, oh my God, this is my favorite, that the historical accuracy, like the idea that, like Crimea was Russia or Ukraine was part of, like this idea. And when people using those arguments, I know for sure that Russia propaganda, someone cooked here. Like Russian propaganda was there, and they kind of some work was done there. Also interesting part of when people are sometimes saying something like, okay, but Putin is actually nice to their own people. And this is exactly problem. I think it also was Michel Foucault or Aimé Césaire, they were talking about it, that there's also a thing called imperialistic boomerang, that imperialistic governments, they are, of course, sure, they are subjugating people in colonies, but at some point they're implementing the same thing on their own people. So it's not nice to live in empires. For sure, we're not saying that this is even near the same as with colonies, but the idea that like Putin is nice to Russian people is not true. And this is, again, also consequences of imperialistic propaganda, the idea to see Putin as an almighty father who will take care of everyone. And what he's for sure is not doing, and Lukashenko is also not doing that. So I think, like trying to rationalize the evil, I think for me, this is when I know that, okay, something is happening there, trying to explain why that person is behaving badly. I think could be important for some analysis, but for the media coverage, I don't think it's necessary, because I don't think that we are putting enough of we don't emphasize enough of, okay, what we need to do to stop it. So for me, this is and I think Crimea as well. Like when people start talking about that, people in Crimea wanted something. I think this is also one of the sign that we have different perception of the imperialism here.
And this is still, even though the full-scale invasion is now going on for more than 3 years, a topic sometimes that, also like in public discussions, you mentioned that this is a very problematic tendency, trying to balance Ukrainian and Russian voices. Can you explain a little bit why, from your Ukrainian perspective, this is so problematic?
I think that in the relationship of again, empire and colony, there is not equal, it's power dynamic. There is always someone who had more power, more coverage, more culture somehow, and so on. So with if we're, for example, taking example of Slavic studies, for all of those years, Slavic studies were most predominantly Russian studies. And again, if we talk about Slavic culture, there is a lot of different cultures, not only Russian. But somehow it was predominantly Russian. And if you wanted to study Slavic culture, people will advise you, okay, you better focus on Russian language because, first of all, there is more sources, there is more information, there is more researches that made about that. Let's focus on that; it will be easier. And this is how imperialism worked. Like somehow information about one culture became just easier to get. I think one of the problems here is to understand that subconsciously people in some societies, and I think predominantly, I don't want to say only in West, but for some people, since they could have some sentiment and positive sentiment towards Russian culture, subconsciously they would like to hear more from Russian side, because again, this is something that you kind of hear more about. And, for some cultures that were imperialistic in past, it's just easier to connect to Russian imperialistic culture. But we are not equal. This is not the war of two equal entities that just are fighting over some apple. It's not it's not something that Trump is trying to portray as two kids fighting over a toy. This is for sure power dynamic with a huge nuclear country attacking smaller non-nuclear country that actually it should defend by the agreement, the Budapest memorandum, and therefore, when we are trying to say, okay, we need to hear Russian side and Ukrainian side, we kind of completely forget that this is not equal entities and this is not equal conflict. This is power dynamic conflict. This is a moment when there is very obvious aggressor and there is a side that tries to defend its borders. By trying to put them on the same level, we kind of erase all ethical requirements here. We kind of try to say, okay, yeah, whatever, that's just reality. We will just forget about that and let's talk about this, how we can basically make it done or finish that. And here we can, just do the circle when we start to talk. And again, here we talk about justice. Because when we're talking about ending the war, yes, there are no other people who want to end this war more than Ukrainians, but we want to have a justice, because we will be the one who will live with this injustice, and we will need to recover the country and also grieve with all the losses that we have right now and presumably will have in future. So I think that this is important to understand, that by trying to put Ukrainian and Russian on the same level, we kind of denying the idea of justice in the world itself. And it could be easier from the practical point of view, but I'm not sure that people actually want to live in that kind of world.
I cannot imagine how it really feels, but from the outside, I imagine it's also kind of traumatizing, right? So to put, someone with you on a panel, assuming that you're okay with it, while, the country of the other person's origin is invading your country, right, and killing people on a daily basis, right? I'm not a psychologist, I'm not an expert in this field, but I assume it kind of sounds very traumatic to me.
I mean, I just think that this for sure depends on very person that facing that, because again, there are people who can just imagine the dialogue with some active Russian opposition or leaders. I can imagine that there are people like that. There are also Ukrainians who are triggered just by Russian language on the streets. I myself just think that right now, this is not time for Russian liberals opposition to talk. This is their time to listen and ask questions. But to be honest, I don't see personally that there is a willing to listen and to ask questions. I see that there is a willing from their side to victimize themselves. But this is a different problem, and this is also a little bit connecting to Russian idea of their imperialistic image, of that they are the victim of the world and everyone is jealous of them. That's why they are like, if you are a victim, you can never attack anyone. You cannot be aggressor. This is like a logical mistake that they are making. So I think that from my perspective, if there is any Russian person who try to like have a discussion, I'm always saying that this is time for you to listen, because you actually had a lot of time to talk. So maybe there's also homework that they need to do, and that homework is very painful. And I'm in those moments, I'm very, very happy that I'm not Russian. I'm not jealous of that, because to be in that, to be able to reflect on what I am part of, and what is me and my identity, and to acknowledge that you were shaped by the aggressive policies and culture that is based on killing others. I think it's super complicated, and it's not very pleasant work, but it should be done, because otherwise I do not believe that Russia will exist, because all empires are falling. This is not forever. So, but this is my personal, not as a representation, a representator of Ukrainians, but more of like my own opinion is that they just need to listen right now instead of talking.
Talking about self-reflection, decolonization is not only about how others see, like in our case, Ukraine, it's also about how Ukrainians see themselves. What would you say? What internalized imperial narratives are still present within you, yourself, and maybe within Ukraine, in the society more general?
There is a very nice work of Gugi Vatayongo, Decolonization of Mind, on the mind. First of all, decolonization starts with you and with your work on yourself. This is exactly the last book that I worked on. I was trying to describe 7 stages of decolonization that all of us were feeling right now, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes not. First of all, I think it's self-value, but self-value not because someone else attacked us, just because of the self-value. It's, again, I'm always trying to create those metaphors through their people relationship, because I think it's easier. It's when you want to, lose weight because someone else, broke up with you, and you just want to prove that you are cool. And this is completely different with the idea that you just want to do sport because you want to feel better after this relationship. The idea that you are a vector of your active, actions, a vector of your action is not created by someone else. It comes from the self-worth. And this is, I think, something that we need to work on. And I know that it will take a lot of decades for us, because this is something that Russia was erasing for a long time, and we need to build it ourselves. Like the idea that, okay, we are valued, we are important. One of the examples that I kind of like a lot, there is a Ukrainian artist, Maria Primachenko. And when BBC, even Ukrainian BBC, were writing about her, was writing about her, in the title, they write, "The artist who inspired Picasso, Ukrainian painter." So instead of saying, okay, Ukrainian Maria Primachenko painter, we're describing her, kind of give her value from the perspective of Picasso. And we call it like, this is self-deprecating perception, or like we call for a long time, when you open the articles about Ukrainian cities, one of the biggest compliment to the city will be the small Paris, or Ukrainian Paris. Or I remember, I wrote about that in the book. It was 12 years ago. I was in Carpathian mountain, and there was a small tour to Carpathian, like beautiful site of Carpathian mountains, and the name of the tour was Ukrainian Switzerland. And I was looking at that and thinking, oh, is there anything in Switzerland called like like Ukrainian Carpathians? Like it just this is how you understand. Okay, something is wrong, or like I remember also one of my friends, she posted something from Paris, and someone else wrote, "Oh, you look like a Parisian girl." Like those kind of thing. I think we need to work on that. But again, I don't think it's our fault what was done to us, but this is our responsibility, what we're going to do with that. So right now we just need to focus on our value, and basically we need to create very, very, very strong state. By saying strong state, I do not mean only military, for sure, but it should be self-sustainable, and also not be dependent on others. For sure, this is something that we need to have.
Talking about what Ukrainians beginning to confront or unlearn some of these narratives. So what a person living in Ukraine or now living abroad, due to the war, what can one do, to unlearn these narratives?
I just think that self-reflection helps a lot. First of all, I just language, the easiest way, the most easiest way, just read some Ukrainian books. Because again, right now, language is, despite the whole tendency of the world kind of leaning towards electronic books, in Ukraine, publishing is just basically blooming because, again, we have this renaissance of Ukrainian language and Ukrainian books right now. So the easiest way is just read more Ukrainian books, and that's for sure, that's enough. Again, because decolonization, it's something that requires resources. You cannot do it as just a hobby. It's something that you need to put some effort to that, because decolonization is the creation of a new man. Again, it's not me. I'm not so smart to say that, but this is something that Fanon said for a long time. And when we're talking about creation, some part could be about killing, or like you need to erase something from yourself. I'm not saying, again, Fanon is very violent here. I'm not saying that you need to push it away or deny that it was there, but it's important to not cultivate it. So again, the example that I was making for a long time, the street where I was raised was called Artema, named after the Soviet factory. But right now, name of the street is Sichevik, which is completely different name. And for a long time, it was very hard for me to understand that the road, the street, my street, actually, I don't know anything about this new name. And I actually don't know this name. I know everything about the previous name, and I know everything about Artema Street, but not about this new identity, new street. And instead of pushing the idea of, no, we should not rename it, we should make it as before, I acknowledge, okay, that street and that history will just remain in my head, because right now we cannot build new Ukraine with old symbols, and this is normal. That we need to be prepared for something new, and that means that we need to kind of, in a nice way, say goodbye to something that was in past. So for sure, I think that reading in Ukrainian language, listen to or consume Ukrainian product, for sure that works. Also understand that it's okay to have to understand, acknowledge that you have a Russian or Russian connected past, but also just remember that decolonization is first about love. And it basically, for me, this is the main idea, because you want to decolonize yourself, not because you hate Russia, not because you are thinking about Europe. You want to decolonize yourself because you want your friends to be alive, your family to be alive, and your home to be there. And this comes from the point of love. So I think that's also enough.
What gives you strength to continue this self-reflection for yourself and to spread the word about it? What gives you strength, Mariam?
I do not feel like I have a choice, to be very, very, very honest. I don't think that maybe just when war started, it was kind of obvious question, okay, what I'm going to do. I know that I'm not courageous enough to go to the front line. I'm okay with that. I can acknowledge it. I do not need to say to myself, okay, it's not a place for me. I don't think war is a place for everyone, for anyone. And I realized, okay, I need to do something. that can help my brother to not be injured, to not die. And I basically start to do what I think I can do the most, which is talking. It sounds funny. And I remember when my brother was injured, I was thinking, okay, am I stopping now or not? And I realized, okay, I think I will decide to continue. I think that the strength comes from the love, because again, this is like, I think you have a choice when you have a privilege to choose. When you don't have a choice, it doesn't feel like it. I think it was Brené Brown who said that, like, the option to not talk about something is a position of privilege. When you don't have the privilege, you will talk about this no matter what. So I think this is the answer.
Thank you so much for sharing these insights with us and for taking so much time for this podcast. Thank you so much, Mariam.
Thank you.